is that we are all happy and proud to welcome you here, to welcome you back. And this is what I might call the pride of trust. The trust that Professor Jeffrey Hosking devoted a whole book to. He'll tell us more about it during his session tomorrow. But this is a book about trust in history. I'm not sure about history, but talking about the modern times and our life and the existence of this school. Trust is an asset of outstanding value. Times are never easy to live, but the times we're in today are special in some ways, and the trust towards our school, towards what we do and talk about, is an important and fundamental constituent part, not just of this seminar, but also of that profession, or indeed the discipline of civic education, which might at times be risky, that we have all devoted our lives to. We have recently held a meeting, a staff meeting of the school, and this small and very courageous team of people, and we have reiterated this formulation whereby the risk and the ability to stand for one's beliefs, to stand one's ground, is a sign of a life in its blossom. It is difficult to restrain oneself. One may think about some new things, and as Merab Mamardashvili said, not to be born. One may live one's life and have never having been born. And he also wrote about this automatic nature of life. And this is indeed the production of the dead, reiteration, the routine, the automation is rather from the dead than the quick. And so, whereas the thought which is mobile, the active stance, is when we do get born and when we live our lives. This is not about something that we can feel at every moment of our days, but we certainly feel this when it does come and enshroud us. We can thus make a distinction between the true and the false. Man is born with a poetical, a divine foundation, which is related to such concepts as trust and freedom, the morals, and then that man is also immersed in the prose of daily routine. So we should always find the middle ground, compromise, which is especially difficult for the society per se, because the society always vies to strike such balance by using the figure or symbol of justice. It is often this symbol is arrogated by one or another country, and this test is failed then at times. And in that same way, every human being balances. He or she lives in a non-ideal world, and in the same way, every person must have a morals, just as the society needs morals. You cannot live in a society without morals, because then it is not a society. because then we're talking about some rather atomic desires and wishes. The public good is what we talk about here during our seminars. We say that this fine string of the poetic beginnings in us, where God, freedom, and conscience come together, and the reality of compromise is born, the dignity and the respect for the minorities. These are the things which are regulated in society by the law, within a society governed by the rule of law. Inna, who is our program author and coordinator, who always quotes that phrase, which is a motto of this seminar. You may read it at the beginning of your program, but there's also another phrase that Ina always likes to cite, is that the law is the only thing that God thinks about on earth, and the law implies freedom. We as humans, as individuals, throughout the Soviet years that we have lived through, have unfortunately lost this feeling or this concept of freedom. It is difficult to revert to something that people have forgotten about. Because of that, we're trying to remind ourselves of that. When we talk about the West, when we talk about Europe, it is not in geographical terms, but rather about as an idea of humanity and enlightenment. To us, Europe is not the European Union in an isolated way. Europe is a world of values which are united by the Christian values, born and grown through humanism, the Renaissance, Reformation, and a number of other very important stages in the European history, wherefrom Europe grew up. And I might belong to a minority in this sense, but I think that in today's culture, the minorities have the same rights as the majorities. And I apologize for saying a commonplace, is that Russia is a country of European culture, but it is not a country of European political culture yet. And Russia has a notion of freedom, but it may not be sufficiently versed in the institutions which guarantee this freedom. So our seminars tackle this subject, among others, because most of you already have a knowledge of our seminars. Let me just remind you that we are within the framework of free discussion, free exchange of opinions, and every person has the right to express his or her views. And the meaning and purpose of this seminar is that the different views must indeed be viewed in terms of compromise. And this is a part of the model of partnership that we propose. My last remark would be is that our seminar is broadcast, and the technology allows many people around the world to get tuned into our seminar, but the technology also makes up and opens up culture, and in this sense, this is also a sign of modern culture. I would like to give the floor to Inna Berezkina, the author of our program. Thank you very much. I'm not an author of this program for sure, but I will say just a couple of words. Thank you. This seminar is a special seminar, and the time when we are conducting this seminar is also special. I'm not prepared to go into detail, but I shall allow myself a metaphor. When we were creating the program of this seminar and we were publishing the program, you might have noticed that in the first iteration, this was more of a utopian or a crystal ball. And about a week ago, this crystal ball was indeed broken into millions of shards, and what could we do? Should we glue this crystal ball back together or make a new one? So we have really redressed or indeed changed this program. We have had different reasons why many of our colleagues and experts have not been able to come, but when the news came that our friend and expert Mr. Piotr Szwitarski had a car accident, and thanks be to God that he is safe and sound. But however, we were very concerned, and we knew that our experts are dear to us, and we have a conscience that and a concept that every next seminar must be a step forward, and it seems to me that what we have done is a step forward in terms of the program of this event. With respect to the strange times that we go through, we have illustrious historians and philosophers and prominent experts, and I hope that Yuri Petrovich would also support me when I say that we have lived through everything. One can read good old books starting from the Old Testament and Thucydides to understand that we are not alone in history. And let me just, those who listen to Lena's remarks might remember her saying that one has to listen to all views and opinions, but this work of deliberation is still very personal, and that every human being, every person must embark on his or her own path of deliberation. Dalai Lama has a great text where he says about this very personal path. And we have some teachers and mentors around us who permit us to hear some very, very special things. So we are very lucky to have this seminar. So let me inaugurate us all on this 7-day adventure. I would like to give the floor for the welcoming remarks, Mr. Tom Blanton. Secondly, I think you will gain a lot by communicating with him. So thank you for having agreed to open this seminar with me.
Здравствуйте, доброе утро.
Good morning. Thank you very much indeed, Lena.
I was very happy to see I have been promoted in the program to the head of the archive of all state secrets. And this is, in fact, my ambition, our ambition, to take all the secrets from all the states and make them open. This is what my non-governmental organization does in Washington, using Freedom of Information Act. So, of course, and later I will hand out secret documents. It's what I do because they're fun, they're interesting, they're useful, they're not necessarily true. Many of them are written by the CIA, and we know how good the CIA is. Just look at the Iraq weapons of mass destruction and how smart they were, right? But I just want to say by way of welcome that 1 month ago, one of the great triumphs of American-Russian cooperation was completed, and nobody noticed. The last chemical weapons came out of Syria and were destroyed. This is an amazing accomplishment. It has never happened in the history of civil wars that in the middle of a conflict, international actors could come and take away a huge body of weapons from the combatants. And yet, nobody noticed because Ukraine, Crimea, tension, sanctions. I would just say, in my word of welcome to all of you, there still are opportunities like that which will make a difference to our whole world and which will save human lives. And our job, I think, is to look for those opportunities and grab them. So it's a real joy for me to be here. It's a real honor to be next to Lena and Yura and all the minds who've made this incredible institution. This is a global institution. This is a world-class institution. And I'm very proud to be a very small part of it. And I'll give you the secrets later. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tom. Thanks. I hope that Tom will have a presentation for us one day, and we think that what Tom does is a very important attribute of democracy, of confronting the authorities with the imperative of becoming transparent, and this is a duty not just for this is a duty for the entire world and all societies. So we anticipate you to come and present at our seminar. Let me also give the floor to another to our very prominent expert, a member of our advisory board, and Maxim Trudolubov, a prominent Russian journalist who is a co-author of Vedomosti newspaper. and he is the author of the opinions column at the Vedomosti newspaper. And indeed, Maxim gives us a very vivid picture of the world, and what he does with his pen and what he does with his talent is to our great benefit. He registers history, and the historians of future times, who will certainly study our times together with all others, will be following these texts, these articles, these opinions, these comments. The interpretation of a fact permits us to open up our vistas and to extend the limits of understanding. We have great friends, Jeffrey Husking and Jutta Scherer, who have great knowledge of history, and I think that history is in many ways a matter of interpretation. Jeffrey interprets it through trust, and Maxim Trudolubov, we will hear how does he interpret this history in front of us. Thank you very much, Elena. I'm very glad to be here again. I'm glad and honored to talk at the opening of this seminar, which promises to be yet another intellectual feat. And I would like to congratulate Elena and all the team of the school. When you say, when you speak about interpretation, interpretation is probably not possible nowadays. We are at a very difficult point of history when we are not fully aware of what is going around us, but we're trying to. The important thing which is in front of us, and I, as a journalist who deals with opinions, can say that we are trying to support the quality of interpretation. And this is in part possible thanks to dividing between the facts and commentaries. And what is important, probably more important today than at any other time, is that we have tried to educate our reader to differentiate between the fact and the comment, which is probably the bedrock of any journalism. And it is sometimes difficult. It is sometimes very difficult to differentiate this in the modern times against the background of the attempts of many governments to not to allow the readers, the viewers, and the listeners to differentiate between the fact and comments and the fact and opinion. However, and we know that we live in a time when many fictions are born every day, and when the desired is presented as the factual. So indeed, it is our task at such times to make this, draw this demarcation line between the fact and comment, and to be ever more attentive to those opinions which, in our view, should be heard. And the work with information, intelligence, and the view and indeed these are some basic things that any citizen today must have. I would like to wish this seminar a very fruitful week. I hope that this program will be of interest to you, and that you will come back. And thank you, Lena. Thank you for allowing me to come here. I am very honored to be complimented by an author who likes his readers. Our expert is missing. We are calling our expert. He is here. Is he here? Yes, he is. He's coming. He's on his way. Colleagues, this pause allows me to redress the mistake that Lena made, having not allowed me to speak at this opening ceremony. I'm very, very pleased to see you all. We will have a very interesting week, and the more interesting are the times around us, the more vibrant we may be in our sessions with the experts. Thank you. Thank you, and I congratulate you on continuation, on perseverance. So, colleagues, let me start with this session, and I will allow Lena to introduce the first expert of this seminar. Apart from the very personal and warm feelings and the feeling of acknowledgement and gratitude that I feel to Mr. Anatoly Adamishin, I've always been a classless animal, and Mr. Adamishin has always been a career diplomat. But even in those times, which were quite difficult for this country, the people of high morals, the people of sharing the higher values could still find each other. And something that I would like to say before the beginning of this session is that I'm very, very proud to notice how it is possible to retain this moral and to help the society develop it. I'm very glad that Anatoly Leonidovich Adamishin has agreed to inaugurate this seminar with his lecture, or indeed this session. The topic of the international position of this country is gaining an ever-increasing relevance today. So it is my pleasure to open this session and this seminar by a talk to Mr. Adamishin. Thank you.
First of all, let me thank you, and this is a great honor for me to open this representative gathering. And following what Lena has just said about difficult times and how you should behave under such times, yesterday I read 5 advices to liberals in non-liberal time. It may support you and help you to understand how to behave. I'm not going to talk about the international situation. My topic is foreign policy and national interests. That will do, I think. For about 20 minutes, I'll be giving you pseudo-theoretical things, and then I'll leave time for questions, right? Any foreign policy should promote or protect, support national interests of your country, of your states. So far, it is pretty simple. And you say about protection of your national interests, and we were staunch supporters of socialism in the Soviet time, but then you have a certain riddle. Who determines these interests? That is the question. Who may formulate them on behalf of the country? Let us take some innocent but proper form, meaning that the task of the foreign policy is to set up conditions which are most proper for the internal developments. In this regard, I quote a smart person who lived about 150 years ago. He formulated very well the tasks for foreign policy. This is Chancellor Gorchakov in his presentation to Alexander II, and that's what he said. Under modern situation in our country, see, modern situation of our country. So the special attention of Russia should be given to our internal developments. And all our foreign policy should be submissive to this particular task, internal development. It's very well said, but he added something else. All efforts of our policy are aimed at Russia being separated from some foreign actions. You mean, well, foreign or outside actions. Are they important for you? Are they gainful for you? And then you decide. These are nice formulas. But in practice, it turns out to be something else. Our foreign policy is determined and implemented not in the interest of the population of the country, but in the interests of the ruling group. And the gap is inevitable. Well, the issue is the scope of this gap. And the gap relates to the internal policy of this ruling group in the first place, and what is the chief goal for the ruling group in the internal policy. the chief goal is to stay in power as long as you can. A politician thinks that he should always be in the lead and at the top. So this gap is inevitable, and it depends on the balance of power between the authorities and the society. If the society has no authority, has no power, the powers that follow their own interests and their imaginations about what happens in the world, which is even worse. But if the society is quite efficient in leveraging the powers that be, then it may seriously correct the foreign policy. So one of the brightest manifestations of this is the Vietnam War in the States. I mean, the response in the States, anti-military manifestations, and so on. And they played a very important role in the fact that the American administration stopped the war in Vietnam and moved back. So the developed society does not rely on the conscience of people who are at the wheel, at local or at the state level, or at the federal level for that matter. This developed society does its best to teach the authorities and to find or to make the situation, to turn it into such a way that authorities and the people try to find common ground. And there is a very nice formula. If the society doesn't control the authorities, then the authorities control the society. Well, you can argue, well, there is a mass support of the foreign policy inside the country. Then there should not be any gap, but there is. And the bad example is the Germany in time of Hitler, because the support was almost 100%, but the result of this policy was a ruin. So you should not follow the magic of the figures. If you are supported by the majority, then this foreign policy is correct. That's not always the case. Now, a couple of examples to understand these formulas better. I will take my examples from the past, because we sometimes forget about the past. Let us take Brezhnev time, 18 years of stagnation. The foreign policy of the Soviet Union had one refrain, to avoid war. And this is an absolutely right setting of an issue. And it was put forward, and our people were always saying, anything but war, anything but war. And we were ready to suffer to avoid war. You are young people, but at that time there was a limerick. A star came from the star and hit the pants of my boyfriend, but this is fine, but let us avoid war. So this was a very important achievement, because at that time the world was at the brink of the nuclear apocalypse. But this idea was very gainful for the authorities, even internally speaking, because Brezhnev was the peacemaker. And that's why people actually supported him and the ruling group. This went on for almost 2 decades. There was no war, but there was no peace at the same time. Well, I mean the international peace. And we saw the international world through the confrontation of 2 public systems. I remember an office of Yuri Andropov in Kremlin. It was just one time when I saw him at close quarters. We brought him the draft of his speech. For a political consultative committee of the Warsaw Treaty. And he just said, well, the land issue is under resolution. We looked at each other and we didn't understand why there was nothing about the land in this project. And he said, well, the issue is who will bury whom. So not only in Brezhnev time, but even earlier, this was the chief mantra of our foreign policy. So evidently it was about good international conditions for internal development. But to achieve these conditions, we had to retain the socialist camp, so to speak, which was difficult in itself. And on the other hand, we had to defeat our chief opponent, which is the United States of America, which was not very simple too. So this was the burden, great burden for our country. On the one hand, people worked for themselves, meaning to secure a certain development of their lifestyle, but part of their time they worked for somebody, meaning for the victory of the socialism all over the world. And they were ideological strategy of the ruling group, which supported this policy, and the people were proud of it, saying that we are superpower, we are one of the 2 superpowers in the world. Since 16th century, we feel ourselves the large power, and for this, well, let's say imperialistic feelings, people were ready to suffer some material burden, and this was enrooted actually in the hearts of our people. There was a play, nobody remembers it now, a play of our Soviet writer, Perishment of a Squadron, and the crew talk to the Bolshevik commissar, and this commissar is a woman. That was the end of the Civil War, bad situation, the country is weakened, and somebody asks her, shall we be able to move on? And she says, yes, we will. We shall hit them. We'll give them a punch. So actually, this feeling that we are not to be loved, but we are to be afraid, meaning people should frighten us. because we are strong, which is not right. So the fight for peace is good. But arms race went on, conflicts went on. Then it was a time of Afghanistan for 7 years. As a result, nuclear war was averted by building up arms, meaning if I have no less arms than you have, then you will not be able to attack me. This is a twisted logic. Probably it was proper at a certain period of time because you need to have certain deterrent so that no risky actions are taken against you. French people, for instance, they used a different approach. Their principle was that France should be able to hit a possible aggressor to make it detrimental, meaning to kill as many people as the population of France is. That was a very proper criteria. They say that our submarines within half an hour may kill 50 million people, and that's enough for us. And it was not enough for us, because in the twisted ideological strategies, the arms race was a kind of a form of class struggle, and you cannot stop the class struggle. As a result, by the end of the Brezhnev period, for each citizen of the world, Americans and Russians accumulated 4 tons of TNT for each person, for each citizen of the world. And this is absurd, and it had to be stopped. But Brezhnev, Andropov, and Chernenko, in smaller degree, still they were not able to sign peace with a class enemy. It was done by Gorbachev, and we have to thank him for this. And our class enemy number 1 was definitely the United States of America. Gorbachev knew that the arms race is absurd, but at the same time the country was going down at the same time, because it was overloaded by arms race, by supporting local conflicts in many parts of the world, by helping liberation movements elsewhere, by assisting our friends, good and bad friends in different countries. These were weights which pulled us down to the bottom. And Gorbachev actually started trying to throw away these weights, and he managed to do it. This was a very resolute step which took place in our society by someone, and I'm getting back to the topic of national interests here. So for him, the interests of the country were dearer than his own interests. how did he prove it? He proved it by the fact that former untouchable system of the General Secretary and so on. So he questioned it. He might stay on for no less time than Brezhnev did, but he chose something else for himself, chose a different fate for himself. And within this brief period of time, which was called perestroika, we made serious achievements. And actually, I can read you the list of these achievements, because Gorbachev is criticized now very much, and you forget things, and you do not remember normal achievements. Now, Gorbachev's team ended the ideological confrontation, removing the image of the enemy. It stopped the Cold War with the states and their allies. It stopped arms race, which was detrimental for the country. It stopped the 9 years of Afghanistan war. It regulated a number of regional conflicts. It normalized the relationships with China, and you shouldn't forget about this too, because when Gorbachev came to power, our relationships with China was those of animosity. The relationships with Israel were restored, and cooperation appeared with this country. Now, Germany was reunited, and we made a peace, a real peace with Germany. We didn't try to hold the former socialist camp countries, and there were no upheavals or revolts in the former socialist countries. Human rights situation was improved, and for the first time the Soviet Union was open for the outside world. There are other items in this list, but this is enough, as a matter of fact. But that was a very brief period when our foreign policy of the Soviet Union was in line with the national interest of the Soviet people. And this period was unfortunately very brief, and it was rather an exception against the background of policy which was not in line with profound interests of Russia or the Soviet Union, for that matter. And that is what I had to say by way of introduction. Actually, I wanted to tell you a few words about Gorbachev's role in perestroika. Actually, Russia was weakened after all these events, but it received ideal conditions at the outside front. We had no longer enemies. We were improving cooperation with the Western states. Well, this cooperation was not entirely successful, and it's not necessarily our fault. Western countries were afraid of receiving us because we are too big, too unpredictable, and so on. But conditions for the internal construction were close to ideal. That's it. Dear colleagues, let us thank our expert for this introduction. We have a lot of time for discussion, and I think that everybody would be able to ask questions. Please use your chance. Anna Uryadova is the first. Good day, Anna Uryadova from Yaroslavl. Your two theses were it was good to have a foreign policy without wars, and second, national interests do not provide for the inclusion of ideology into a foreign policy. So our history is the history of wars based on national interests, as politicians say. So how do you determine national interests then? How do you determine national interests? Actually, I thought that I was describing it. Okay, let us repeat the statement. National interests, the way I see them, are in building an economically, politically, and democratically developed society, improvement of well-being of people, inclusion into the global streamline, and desire to avoid conflicts and definitely wars. These are the parameters. Well, I don't like when people say that Russia should become a normal state. Definitely, Russia should switch its notion about what makes a country to be strong. So far, Russia has not developed an image which is attractive for neighbors or not neighbors. The country that cares about well-being of its citizens, the country which, as Gorchakov said, avoids foreign unsubstantiated activity, the country which does its best to develop itself internally. Slava Inozemtsev knows it better than me. So we move on. Timur Zhakhov, Ingushetia. It's very interesting interpretation of achievements of Mikhail Gorbachev. And you mentioned the stopping of civil war, of Cold War, I'm sorry. He stopped the Cold War on the side of the Soviet Union, but on the other side, it didn't stop. And I mean, this Cold War goes on from the other side. And you also said that, I mean, you didn't say it, but Mikhail Gorbachev made lots of debts, and then we had to pay for these debts. And you also mentioned that in the first place, there should be internal interest and not external interest. But in Gorbachev's time, there were things which made the chain reaction inside the country, I mean conflicts in the Northern Caucasus and so on. How would you comment on this? Oh, it's a long story. Okay, the Cold War. You mentioned the Cold War in the first place.
if we call a spade rather than go for understatements. To be blunt, we have lost the Cold War. Gorbachev, in point of fact, actually signed conditions of peace after the end of the Cold War. Certainly, that for the side that lost those conditions turned out to be, well, maybe tougher than they may have been otherwise. But this is where we're speaking about the position of our main partners in the international arena. The very idea by Gorbachev was such that as we stop the Cold War, that would be step one, the required stage to draw the line after the first period. To start the second phase, we first had to continue cooperating with the United States of America, and based upon that, we should regulate the position in the world. I don't know if this was the right concept or not, but what it promised quite nice outcomes. But this is where we saw that the situation within the United States has played a role in this situation. Reagan and his Secretary of State Schultz, they were all for this sort of cooperation with the Soviet Union. President Bush, who came to be the president, took a different path. He continued to acknowledge that we, America, have won in the Cold War. The collapse of the Soviet Union is best proof of this, which is that President Bush Sr. openly stated that this country is a country that lost. Against this background, for that matter, this is where there was a certain euphoria among the American nomenclature that led it first to Iraq and then to Afghanistan, because they thought that afterwards that they will stand to win and gain the upper hand in any problem they might tackle. Whereas our apparatchiks, our administrative classes that didn't face defeat in open war. There was no Arc de Triomphe, there was no open conflict. But we instead gained some arrogance for the future. Well, we haven't lost anything. We could have even won. This is what they thought. Come on, guys, let's try to be more proud about it. Let's show more pride about it. So the situation about the change of government in the United States and focus on domestic, first of all, considerations, where America is a God-chosen country that gained the upper hand in the conflict. This is one side of the story. For that matter, I'm very happy that President Bush actually didn't stand to win much from this. When President Clinton ran a race against him, he found an excellent formula. Bush thinks he won the Cold War, but this is just like a rooster who thinks that that the sun rose just because he cried "Cookie Doodle-doo." But it didn't certainly bring a victory. There was a certain very difficult and hard to overcome scheme, or rather algorithm, that was put in place within the American system, where they could not allow any country to be more powerful than them. But this is where a serious mistake was committed by the Americans, and they're still continuing to try to amend it. Another side of this story is that is that Gorbachev did all that, hoping that the Soviet Union will stay in place. The very fact that the Soviet Union disappeared, this really certainly undermined the conditions in the international arena as well. The question is why the Soviet Union collapsed. Could it be Gorbachev who did this, who worked for this? And could it be that in Belaverskaya Pusha, this is the venue of where the three Slavic republics signed a special agreement. But my position is that this fight for power was the reason why the Soviet Union collapsed. This is the most elementary thing that happens in a country that has gained a certain freedom for political activities. And I disagree that there was some kind of euthanasia about the Soviet Union. No. It is not known how long it would have stood. Well, there's this argument that all the intelligence services across the globe, CIA and others, have certainly overestimated the strength of the Soviet Union and never thought it would collapse. That's why they are sort of abusing the intelligence. I think the intelligence community were right, thinking that the Soviet Union has certain potential yet to continue, probably to preserve the Soviet Union as a political and another entity, it probably would have been impossible at that time. But to keep the same country in place, one country in place, that was possible. And just plain fight for power, this is what stood in the way, because for Boris Yeltsin, when he attended Belaverskaya Pusha, the most important thing for him was to overthrow Gorbachev. Certainly Kravchuk played a certain role there, and so on, played into his hands, and so on. So you are saying that the Cold War is not over, and this continues until now. Well, I disagree about this. I think that, well, at least beginning with Gorbachev's time, and then Yeltsin time, then there was early times of President Putin, who was, for that matter, was considered to be pro-Western. That was his policy pursued. Still, at that time we saw greater cooperation, more cooperation than struggle. And this really played into our hands in many ways. Americans withdrew the troops from Europe, and they substantially cut down the numbers of the manpower there. But they're now saying they are now dusting their plans, military plans that date back 20 years. To think that the Cold War continued against us, I suppose this is a mistake, a factual mistake, because look, many things happened about the integration of Russia into the global economy and into G8, where we're now trying to expel us, and WTO, and to G20, and so on. We cannot claim that they're still continuing to wage a Cold War against us. No. What makes it possible for us to think that somebody was playing against us? What? In the Western countries and in the United States first and foremost, it has always been the case, and I suppose it will always be the case, that there will be a certain school of thought that will continue to think that Russia should be not just strangled, but it should be made to kneel. And certainly it's in place, where there is no way we can go without it. But say in times of when Russia continued to cooperate with the West, that kind of public was not much heard. Now again, they are again gaining the upper hand. So let's lay the blame with the West alone. This is where we certainly also played. About the dates. Well, I would look at the figures. Who really accumulated more debt? Was it Gorbachev or was it Yeltsin? Anyways, this is where probably they might be quits. What happened in the country? Well, certainly, for sure, it was Gorbachev's who was to blame for this domestic development. And certainly that was the case. But it's very much like the same as blaming somebody who after this nuclear aftermath that was seeming to be hanging over us, who would say, look, I gave you freedom. Regrettably, this freedom was more used by populist circles. This freedom made it easier to wage political struggle, and in the long run, that helped overthrow Gorbachev. Well, I suppose I've answered all the questions, the three questions that you asked me. Well, I also asked a question about the conflicts. Oh yes, ethnic conflicts. Ethnic conflicts. Ethnic conflicts. They are, again, it depends on what you choose. Whether you choose tough dictatorship that seems to be imposing its strong will against these conflicts, or you want to live in a normal country where the problem is that we're really neglected and seemingly ignored in the terms of the Soviet Union, they would come to the head. So Gorbachev paid the bill, who was actually amassed before him. Dear colleague from second row, you now have the floor. Please use the microphone and remember to give your name. Konstantin Krylov from St. Petersburg. I have two questions, if you will. Question number one as to professional diplomat. Given what you were speaking about, the national interests and the interests of elites and so on, then what is the purpose of diplomacy? To carry out the orders by the minister, by the government, or act based upon our own ideas in national interests? And question number two, a question to a person who had to do with CIS. Do you think, was CIS a stillborn project from the very start due to the ambitions of national ethnic elites that you were referring to? Or did CIS have a chance to evolve into something like the EU? Well, this is a question. I'm very happy to hear it, because it will help me, show my best cards, put my best foot forward. Vladimir Ilyich Lenin used to say that to address an international problem, diplomacy is needed, some 5% of it is needed. All the remaining percent comes from it depends purely on the ratio between the strength of each side. Guys would come up to me and they say, well, do you think we should make an effort because of these poor 5%? I say, yes, 5%, but this 5% has to be executed brilliantly. Well, again, what do we do about diplomats? What should a diplomat do? Well, first and foremost, a diplomat is not a politician. But he is obliged to help politicians in policy. And some telegrams from the international departments show that much depended in initiating international events. If you've got some idea about, say, that in this question, the interests of the country go against the interests of the ruling elite, then you are faced with a very difficult choice. What is it that you have to do? You've got probably three options. First, to surrender and do what you're told. Second, attempt to, in some way, change this situation. And thirdly, quit your job, resign. Well, I won't tell you what choices were faced by whom and who made which choice. But in practical purposes, this is a choice that is faced by every government official. Well, in the years that passed before those years of stagnation, the late Soviet Union, may I tell you that our small cohort, liberal, conventionally speaking, we saw our purpose in trying to somehow minimize the damage that is incurred by us because of the policy. And in some cases, yes, we succeeded. Well, about CIS. Well, I think that the Commonwealth of Independent States, CIS, as it was conceived in Belaverskaya Pushcha, it didn't have much of a future ahead of it. Why was that the case? Because things were done just were done in a very poor manner. May I just show you some parallel with today? They're saying that Kravchuk in Belaverskaya Pushcha kept waiting when Yeltsin will raise a question about the Crimea. The Crimea was just, this question was never raised by Yeltsin. Then this question had to be tackled by, let me put it this way, to amend this historical mistake. Well, much later and in much poorer international conditions and with great encumbrance, with a high price. As the three leaders gathered in Belaverskaya Pushcha, well, I could give you documentation, they didn't know where the nuclear weapons are stored in the Soviet Union. And the question about nuclear armaments was resolved in a very superficial manner. What does it mean? It means that we, in a while, we had to conclude special agreements with Ukraine where it would stop being a nuclear power. This is the notorious Memorandum of Budapest, where the three parties, Russia, the US and UK, undertook to respect the territorial integrity of the Ukraine. It means that the mistakes that were committed in Belaverskaya Pushcha, they actually later continued to bear upon us. The CIS was created not to unite the republics, or rather to alleviate their splitting, to allow for a civilized divorce. Could we really do something that worked? I would say yes, it might be the case, but by the time when they seriously looked at CIS, at that time the positions became so stiff that it was very hard, because after Belaverskaya Pushcha, what we saw quite a much of a fake show-off thing. In CIS, we churned several thousand documents in a brief time. When I joined that ministry and we started to look at how many of these documents might work, only 2 of them could work. The constitution of CIS was adopted in 1994. The constitution, think of it, how you're going to create a commonwealth without having its constitution or its charter. And the very fact that the CIS was something like a gift by Kravchuk to Yeltsin. Yes, okay, let's create this kind of commonwealth of independent states. This put Ukraine in a situation where it could very well, put it plainly, blackmail Russia. And poor Yeltsin was always faced with a dilemma. Should he do something, go against Russia's national interests, but instead satisfy our friends in CIS instead? And since CIS was a justification for the collapse of the Soviet Union, then it means that, well, certainly not all, but many requests that Yeltsin received, they were satisfied according to the principle, yes, you have to pay for this friendship, for friendly disposition. So, and what is going now, right now, about CIS? Well, I suppose it gives us another true proof that we took the right path. That means the economic path, but this is a path that has very little to do with Belawirska-Pucha agreements. Well, dear colleagues, we continue. Please, you now have the floor. Yuri Lobunov from Bryansk. Anatoly Leonidovich. It so happened right now that Russia's foreign policy is now in the focus of the global interest, and even within Russia, it is of greater interest than domestic issues nowadays. Much is being said about it. Well, some people might know something about it, but in practical terms, given the situation we're in right now, if we take a step back into the domain of the idealistic goals, what would be ideally the foreign policy of Russia? Well, give us the outline. Thank you. Well, this is very much like, as Chancellor Gorchakov put it. I would put it this way, that in today's situation, in Russia's foreign policy, there's very little maneuver left for us, very little room for maneuver for us. And I suppose the main maneuver is all about diminish the damage we see in current situation and try to preserve things that can be kept, can be preserved. But to do so, we also need to make very clear choices. That is, we should understand that we should work on every direction, not only about focus on Asia alone. We should understand that this is the time when we have to show patience and bear, and not to fan the flames that are raging around us. I suppose another move that is not cautious, that might really lead to very serious aggravation of the situation for Russia. And when I looked at what the Americans are doing right now, I remembered what Dante said about it. It's not that I know Dante by heart, but I'll give you a couple of quotes probably. Well, Dante used to say, deceit and power, these are the weapons of the evil forces. And right now, I suppose this is the very good example where we could see that this is the case. Vadim Korostelyov, the graduate. Thank you. Anatoly Leonidovich, tell me please, from the perspective of a political scientist, well, Stanislav Beslovsky says that Putin has some kind of defense mentality. And my question to you is about the following. In this kind of mentality, could we have some interests, or could we only speak about our reactive policy that we see in the several years in the Russia's foreign policy? Well, I would say that defense, it's a quite acceptable situation. You cannot always be on the offensive. You should, at certain times, go for defense. The fact that our policy is reactive, well, this probably is the case, but say, the most recent activities and initiatives, well, you might say they are on the defensive, but I would put it they were very, very much proactive and very much independent individual. I would repeat again that nowadays, in my view, the most important thing is to consolidate our positions, not to go any further, try to maintain this consolidation, try to keep it, and try to make peace with the West. There's no point about waging a war with them. We continue, dear colleague from row 2. Yes, somebody's sitting next to Mr. Krylov. Yes, I'm Stanislav Lazovsky from St. Petersburg. have two questions, but they have both historic dimension. Question number one, I'm very interested in hearing your opinion of as somebody who has worked with decision makers at the time. Was the reunification of Germany, did it correspond to the national interests of the Soviet Union? It was done quite, well, basically overnight. And another question that goes deeper into historical memory, if we think about the great game of the 19th century, about the biggest, the most dramatic confrontation between the Russian and British empires, and say Chancellor Gorchakov, despite all the, whatever the British said, he helped promote Russia's position in Central Asia and Central Asia exceeding Russian Empire. And this situation, as we integrate new territories, does it fully comply with our national interests or not? Which was question number one. Yes, yes, so much about reunification of Germany. What shall I tell you? Well, the situation about Germany and the situation about Eastern Europe, that was what followed from one simple solution, for a simple decision to keep the Eastern European countries, including the then GDR. We would not use force to keep them within our orbit. When this became clear, then the events, well, evolved very rapidly in the other direction. Could we keep them in place? Could we retain the Eastern Bloc countries, including the GDR? Yes, we could, but only by using force. There was no other option, there was no other way to address the situation, at least at the time when these quite profound problems came to the head. Well, I suppose that could not be done otherwise in those conditions. Then let us remember what were the conditions at the time. It was a time of ongoing struggle within the Soviet establishment, when what was needed, in my view, at the time to move from one position, we won't let go of the GDR. No way shall we let go. No way shall we allow reunification of Germany. Instead, we should turn to a position when reunification, it's time for Germany to reunite. Let's fight for the best conditions for us. But we continued to maintain that we could not betray GDR. And the only way not to betray GDR was by exercising force. And certainly we had, yes, garrisons, military bases in the territory of the then GDR. Something like 400,000 troops, Soviet troops were in the GDR at the time, deployed at the time. So on the one side, the united Western Front, who spoke in one voice against that. Well, it's not that they were against us, they were rather all for the reunification. Probably France and UK was not so keen. Probably they were not so keen about this rapid reunification, but they thought that this should be done at the expense of the Soviet Union, and this would make us enemies with Germany for a long time. That would make us quarrel. On the one side, we at the same time, this was the Western line that was endorsed by Kohl, the United States, and Kohl, then Chancellor Kohl, agreed about this. And on the other side, our allies who wanted to go away from us, and new people came into government in the then Czechoslovakia and in Poland, solidarity. But on the third aspect was that domestic discord. That was a very difficult situation for decision making, given that things evolved that rapidly. But summing up, I think that the outcome of all this was very much acceptable for Russia. For that matter, we stated where we stated that the borders that evolved in Europe after the Second World War would stay in place, and it was not automatic. At that time, the Hungarian and the Czechs demanded that we should withdraw our troops. The only country that did not insist upon that was the Poles. They said, no, you should first conclude a special agreement with Germany about the borders.
So the borders were consolidated. It was one. Germany was rid of nuclear weapons. And Russia received some financial infusions because of the withdrawal of the troops. And what was most important, Germans in their minds were convinced that they received the keys for reunification from the hands of Gorbachev, since if Gorbachev had used force, reunification could have been achieved through other means. So as an outcome, we had, with Germany, we had some historical reconciliation better than with any other country. And throughout all those years to come, Germany was our partner in terms of economic ties. So I think that given the situation, the situation, the option without violence and blood in Eastern Europe benefited Russia. And should we have behaved in a different way, the outcome would have been the same, but we experienced our problems even earlier than now. What was the other question, please? Dear colleague, please repeat your question. I asked about the confrontation and the inclusion of new territories into the part of the country, as it was the case in 19th century, and standoff with the British Empire. Was it in the Russian interests? And I read the then Foreign Minister, Foreign Chancellor Gorchakov, and would like to learn your opinion about those events. Speaking of Chancellor Gorchakov, I think my opinion would be different from yours, since Gorchakov used to receive British ambassadors who said that Russian troops had captured Samarkand, the city of Samarkand, and Gorchakov replied by saying that it's the first time I hear about that, about the seizure of Samarkand. It was not our intention, and it's not our intention to retain that city in the Russian Empire, but it stayed in the Russian Empire till 1991. So there were various categories. I think Gorchakov used to say the brilliant thing, expansion of territory is the expansion of weakness. I think that in those times, and if I had been a Russian troop commander in that time, I would have done the same. And that was the general mood about territorial expansions. Now the situation is different. Dear colleagues, I would appreciate if you asked just one question, because when our distinguished speaker answers, and if you ask several questions, it's hard for him to keep all your questions in mind. Question from Vachtank of Georgia. Good afternoon, I'm Vachtank Satsanava, and quite recently, Eduard Shevardnadze passed away, former foreign minister of the Soviet Union. I think he was one of the architects of the post-Cold War world. I used to listen to his speeches, and I read his memoirs. What is interesting from your presentation is that probably the entire range of leaders in the Soviet Union of those times realized that divided Germany was not in the interests of the civilized world, but high-ranking officials of the KGB and the Ministry of Defense, they failed to understand that, and we understand that their range of thinking was broader than one may think. I gave a number of interviews on that event, on the death of Shevardnadze, and I say it in public again that Shevardnadze used to be a good foreign minister of the Soviet Union, probably just because of the fact that he appointed me his deputy. He was a decent person working for the benefits of perestroika, and I think that Russia on its behalf gave him a tribute too. And the story I'm going to tell you is not very much known, but there was a period of time in the civil war in Georgia when Gamsahurdia was approaching to Tbilisi, and the capital of Georgia, and in Russian establishment there was a dispute and a quarrel whether they had to help Shevardnadze, and the military insisted that they didn't have to do anything to help Shevardnadze. But still, it was the opinion to help Shevardnadze that prevailed, so that confrontation between Gamsahurdia and Dudayev on the one hand and Shevardnadze on the other hand could be resolved for the benefits of Shevardnadze. We had very little troops in Georgia at that time, but Russian troops got control of the railway, the only transportation link, and it made Gamsahurdia stop his troops, and Russia actually saved Shevardnadze. But having said that, I cannot help telling you that I've read Shevardnadze memoirs too, and then I called his assistant, his aide, and I said that I would like you to convey Mr. Shevardnadze that I'm disappointed totally with his memoirs, because he blames Russia in all troubles that followed, and in the same memoirs I read that when he and Mr. Aliyev were members of the political bureau of the Communist Party, they did a lot in order to bring liberation and independence of Azerbaijan and Georgia closer, and but that was nonsense. They did nothing of the kind, and so I had a feeling that at the end of his life, Eduard Shevardnadze didn't know who he really was. He didn't know whether he had to associate himself with his position in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Soviet Union, or he was the leader of the liberation in Georgia. So his latest statement disappointed me. But I would like to reiterate by saying he had worked very strongly for the benefits of perestroika, and that was the reason that Gorbachev had appointed him foreign minister. So he had a number of private talks with Shevardnadze, and Gorbachev saw that Shevardnadze exposed some democratic values and pursued those values. So I think that in general Shevardnadze was a very decent man, and for Shevardnadze, the death of his wife, who he loved a lot, was a tragedy. But when he was about to marry, his wife said that in her family there were some people who KGB had treated badly, so please choose. And Shevardnadze picked love, but not loyalty to those members of the family, because at some point Shevardnadze had been Georgian KGB chief. So he really left some heritage for the Soviet foreign policy, and we have to be grateful for that. Sasha Azar, question from Ukraine. Okay, so the question about the reconciliation with the West and Ukraine, in what way it can be achieved, and what steps Russia is supposed to make for those reconciliation. if Ukraine maintains its posture towards current situation in the Crimea. Thank you. I would start by saying that, unfortunately, for 23 years in the Russian-Ukrainian relations, we have not done anything. So those years were just lost. And we had to treat Ukraine much more seriously, not the way it was done in those years. But now it's too late to comment on that, and I think that the process of reconciliation with Ukraine will take a lot of time and it will be very painful. The first thing to do is to stop hostilities, to stop war in Ukraine. It's true that perhaps the Americans have another concept, and I experienced it myself. The American concept is the peace under bombs, and we bomb and you talk about peace. Well, I'm not certain, but I feel Americans influence, American trace in Ukraine and the eastern Ukraine. First, I think what is to be done is to stop war. Second, we need to really control the consequences of war. We need to take care of refugees. We need to restore our relations at the human level. And I think that some propaganda campaign can be launched, and it's really true to a certain extent, and it's about the US attempts to pit one people at another people. It's propaganda, but I think it's really true to fact, since the only actor that is not interested in the stabilization of situation there is the United States. It's the only country which benefits greatly from that crisis. It's a great influence on Europe. It's the demonstration of who the boss is and the punishment of Russia. All those points are in the US policy, and the economic benefits are also there. And NATO will be inspired to get more arms. Europeans will have to pay more for arms, and arms are procured in the United States. And speaking of natural gas, if Russia leaves or stops its exports of gas for the Europeans, then the Americans will be able to sell their shale gas to Europe, although it's more expenses. So I think the first step is to be to control the consequences and implications of the current crisis, and we need to meet the Ukrainians halfway in the economic field. I don't think it's appropriate to punish Ukrainians economically, and I think that Ukraine's association with the European Union is quite compatible and is not in conflict with the concept of free trade, with the customs unions, since Russian position has always been like that. We cannot welcome Ukraine's accession to the European Union, but we can live with that. Although if Ukraine joins NATO, it's intolerable. So I think we should revise our propaganda approaches towards Ukraine. I think it's lethal for our relations. I don't understand why that campaign was initiated, and we keep on hearing about the instant or imminent disintegration of Ukraine, and political analysts get together and discuss in real terms when it will happen. Ukraine has made their choice, and we should live with that and try to take some advantage for ourselves from that choice. Your question, please. Good afternoon. I'm Artur Rudakov from Rostov-on-Don. I would like you to revisit the Gorchakov thesis about the ratio between foreign policy and domestic situation. When you worked in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in the Soviet Union, do you think that the society, people welcomed the policy that was pursued by the Soviet Foreign Ministry? Well, speaking of that, I'd like to say then, when I was admitted to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Soviet Union at the age of 22, I had very little idea about the foreign policy. My attitudes and ideas were mostly guided by the Komsomol propaganda about peace and communism. And in the ministry, we didn't have a lot of extra information, so it took time for me to start understanding real things. As for people's responses to the foreign policy of the Soviet Union, I think they mostly welcomed that, because the only thing they were aware of that was that the policy pursued peace and stability. Just mind you, foreign policy questions were not raised in the government or at the plenary sessions of the Central Committee of the Communist Party. It's true that at the party congresses and conventions, reports included international situation sections, but it was not true to fact. So in general, the public welcomed our policy, and they liked the slogan about our being strong and being in a ability to beat anybody in the world, and so it was very advantageous for the leadership at that time. So let's move on, and your questions, dear colleague. I'm Konstantin Ostrovsky from Kaliningrad. Anatoly Konstantinovich, I can recall very well then Russian society heated by empire ambitions and annexation of the Crimea. And the foreign policy now towards the east of Ukraine stopped meeting public aspirations. I don't think that our public is homogeneous about those events. Perhaps if the public is a little prepared to such changes, they can be chauvinistic in a way, and the nationalist feelings are on the high now. But still, I think that there are many people that believe that we don't have to interfere with East Ukraine affairs. So I wouldn't say that a public would welcome the continuation of the involvement, and I think they make their conclusions too. And besides, I believe that most of the people understand that it's a trap, and should we get involved into those hostilities, it would be very hard times for us. You, please. I'm Eduard Amirov from Bashkortostan Republic. Anatoly Leonidovich, your American counterpart, Paul Craig Roberts, who used to work for the finance department, or treasury department. So when you worked for Gorbachev, he worked for President Reagan. So he claims that it's the United States that makes provoking steps. In your presentation, you said that should Russia make another provoking step, Russia would feel bad, but the U.S. counterpart claims the opposite. In 1996, 1987, prior to the disintegration of the Soviet Union, did you see those U.S. promises and how they communicated with Secretary Gorbachev in oral or writing forms? Can you comment on that? Can you give us more details? I cannot make my own investigation, but I'm convinced that Secretary of State Baker, at least one, made very clear proposal of a deal to Gorbachev, and he said that U.S. interests in Europe are secured, were secured by NATO. If Germany stays outside NATO, our interests would not be secured. But we also realize your or Soviet interests, and we think that if Germany stays in NATO, NATO would not move further east. And it was a deal, a very clear deal. Was it in writing? No. And it was never written and signed because to the last minute we stood fast of not letting NATO acquire Germany, entire Germany, and if it is our stand, we could not sign any deal, and it wouldn't have been logical. On the other hand, we took Secretary's word for that, and it was also repeated by Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, and we believe that they will stick to their words. And think we were really cheated because it was not in writing. But as the situation of the Soviet Union deteriorated, and then the Soviet Union disappeared from international scene, and those Western counterparts felt free not to fulfill their promises. And as for the Americans, and sorry, you asked about Germany, and what next? Just Germany. In my question, I asked about current situation too. That Polk Craig Roberts used to write that the Cold War ended with the collapse of the Soviet Union. Now he claims it's the hot war, and he blames Americans for that because they have broken all the agreements with Gorbachev. Okay, thank you for repeating your question. I commented on Gorbachev's stand, but I'm used not to criticize the United States because the United States faces too many critics anyway. However, U.S. policies, speaking in general terms, is very tricky. It's what I refer to as an imperialistic policy, the policy of a power who would like to keep the entire world under their control, and the power that has an ability to do so, and that demonstrates to the rest of the world that I can do something that others cannot do. That's one side of that. But then, if you are faced with a murderer or a robber, what are you supposed to do? Try to fight with that murderer, and what? I used to read that the mission of Russia is to contain the expansionist attitudes of the United States, and I replied by writing, not with me. But I can see that the United States is making a very lethal mistake now. One of my friends writes that looks like the foreign policy of the United States is drafted by China, the Taliban, and Iran, because the three parties are happy with what the United States is doing. They are doing everything so that Russia gets closer to China. cooperation and coordination on Afghanistan is ruined, so the Taliban would feel free to do whatever they do. And Iran would be interested to get rid of too much attention of the world because of other crises. So the Americans are acting counter to their own interests, and the explanation is their domestic policy, since every politician tries to find the most beneficial course of action under the circumstances, and they can just should make up their minds whether to punish Russia deadly or to relax measures. And I think that President Obama leans to a conservative attitude. He has nothing to lose because he's a lame duck already, but elections will come and Democratic Party will have to compete, and if they lose their positions, President Obama can be blamed for that. So because of the domestic policies, Obama is in favor of that arrogant and very tactless policies. But again, everything depends on personal or just private advantages. Okay, so I think it will be the last question. The colleague that has joined us has just joined us. I'm Artem Tarchin from Moscow. You mentioned Budapest agreements when Ukraine agreed to deliver their nuclear weapons to Russia in exchange for U.S. guarantees. North Korea, or South Korea had similar agreements, but the Americans failed to fulfill their guarantees to Ukraine. Would it happen to Japan and South Korea too? And Japan and South Korea, well sophisticated to access their own nuclear weapons. The Budapest Memorandum was not a guarantee, that was an agreement between three countries. I don't know what is the language of the agreement between the United States and Japan and South Korea. But I think if they would make plans to become nuclear powers, they should be prepared to face a lot of problems with China. And I don't think that the Americans will be happy with that too, because proliferation of nuclear weapons is not favored by nuclear states. And here comes Ukraine. And following the 1991 agreements in Belabezhye, when Soviet Union was disbanded, the then Ukrainian leader Kravchuk said, we would have 3 nuclear buttons now. We will have 3 nuclear powers. But if Ukraine, or should Ukraine resume its nuclear status, I don't think it will succeed. And because of Americans and West Europeans, and the situation is very dynamic, and none of the parties would like to see more nuclear powers. Okay, thank you, dear colleagues. We have exhausted our time for Q&A, and in conclusion, I would like to tell you that Anatoly Leonidovich appearances here at the forum, and he's not the first time here, and he spoke on different topics. So those presentations make us recall that the foreign minister does not belong to police or Ministry of Defense. It's not law enforcement agency. Diplomacy is an art, and the fact that we have the pleasure of the company of the person who has every idea about that is great. Excuse me. Speaking of law enforcement agencies and the foreign ministry, I should tell you that at least in the times when I worked there was no demarcation between the ministries, because all the ministries grew up in the times of Stalin, and they soaked his ideas. But in every agency, we had kind of a liberal cell, and it was in the KGB, in the foreign ministry, and even in the central committee of the Communist Party. So there was no much differences between ministries. There was a question that in the Communist Party leaders realized that times were changing, and the KGB and Ministry of Defense, they didn't. Well, Gorbachev, commenting on the crisis of 1980s, said that all options were possible, but a military one, and all KGB and MOD leaders realized that. Well, for me, it's just the time to thank our expert. Thank you for the opportunity to speak. Half an hour break, please.